the PowerPoint, I want to formally introduce Dr. Wendy Belcher. She is the lead scholar of Princeton's Miracle of Mary Manuscript Project. She is a professor in Princeton's Departments of Comparative Literature and African American Studies, where she is a specialist in early written African literature with a particular focus on African languages. She also works as a co-translator to provide access to medieval and early African texts and Ge'ez, including biography, works of philosophy, short stories, and a medieval novel. Her books in progress are Ladder of Heaven, The Miracles of the Virgin Mary in Medieval African Literature, and Art and the Black Queen of Sheba, A Global History of an African Idea. And I just want to add my comment that she is one of the best writers I have ever met or read her work. Just beautiful. And you will soon see
Before we get started, can we like all stand up? Do a stretch. If you're at home, also stand up. I don't know, is somebody good at leading people in stretches?
I am.
Yeah, do it.
At this because you'll get teacher.
Okay. Help us out.
Okay.
That's what
Yes, Anna. You can cross one leg. Maybe if you put your left knee, I'm bad at the direction. Lean forward. So you want to lean towards the leg that you
Crossing.
cross.
That's a good one.
And I'll try to incorporate the breathing this time. So you want to breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out 2, breathe in, breathe out 3. Then I don't know if you want to just kind of go forward a little bit, to kind of give your lower back a break. And you can put one arm up too if you can. Other side. Okay, I think we're good, right?
Yeah. We may have to have you come back and do that again.
Oh, yeah.
I think people are taking a quick break.
Mhm.
Break. I actually myself, I'm gonna run to the bathroom. I'll be right back.
Just more of a technical to. I'm one of this. I'm one of this. There's some. This looks pretty good.
Now my. That's right. Because you have. Sorry, that's what you. So. Nobody was your vote. So let me ask Ms. Goodwin if she has. She said.
Check with my family.
That's not what we had for that.
I just don't feel like I was leaving midway through.
So now you're.
But there's no other place.
So I just want to see it.
So glad I got it.
Conversation.
A lot of people, yeah, introduced them.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. That's nothing about it, like, there's a lot, like.
Now we got it.
Now you're done.
No, I didn't.
So the plan, I mean, this is.
This is.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, I see. Make that up.
I think this is going to be a fine. Well, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Think about it. So that's just sheer.
I don't have to say, okay, it's good.
I'm glad.
Okay,
All right.
At this point, I'll say that. I'm sorry.
okay. The Virgin Mary The Virgin Mary is the world's most storied person. That is, she is the human being about whom the most stories have ever been composed. People in Israel or Jerusalem and in this area first wrote stories about her in the 2nd century, very, very early on in the tradition. Then people in Egypt did. Then the practice spread around the world of composing stories about the miracles she performed over the centuries for anyone who called upon her name. Now, you might think this is unsurprising. After all, devotion to her has been vital in 2 world religions, Christianity and Islam, for over 2,000 years, and probably over 1 billion people pray to her. But consider that few have composed stories about the miracles performed over the last 1,000 years by Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ lives in the Bible. If you're talking to another human being, they might tell you a story about how Jesus helped them find their keys or their mother to be cured from cancer or whatever. But when it comes to stories that people have told, there are far more about Mary than there are about Jesus Christ. That is, stories about what Mary has done for people, let's just say since her death, right? After she died, she has done a lot. You can also say that other famous people, like they live in a particular book and there's no stories afterwards. Muhammad lives in the Quran. There are not a lot of stories about him or the Buddha or so on. They have not inspired these kind of post-life stories the way that the Virgin Mary has. So in this sense, Mary is not just a religious figure. She is humanity's most remarkable literary character. She has appeared in more original compositions, in more languages, by more authors, over more countries, over more centuries than any other person ever. She is also one of the most painted or most illustrated human beings ever. So when it comes to Mary, we have this really rare body of literature and art. It's about one character across continents and languages and periods. And that allows us to see how different cultures have thought about what it means to be human, what it means to be divine, and what the relationships between them can be. So for people in comparative literature, which is in my particular field, this is a dream archive, right? It's a way to do real comparative study. If you can study stories in French and Latin and Ge'ez and Arabic and so many other languages. Now, the stories about the Virgin Mary that have been written in Europe, a practice that started around 1000, there's a lot of scholarship on them. There's a lot of books. There's an amazing book called Alone of All Her Sex by Maria Warner, if you're interested in the topic, and many, many other books on this topic. But there's not that many books about what happens in Africa, right? The writings that have been done about her in Africa. So, you can see even just in these illustrations, we're talking about stories today, but that there's so many different ways in which people have portrayed the Virgin Mary, from the Pieta to queer women to all over the world, all of these different types of stories. And a lot of these, when you think of the Virgin Mary, depictions of her, you tend to think of the European paintings. But in fact, these stories about the Virgin Mary were really late in Europe. They began around the 1000s, and that's because stories from the Levant, that is like Egypt and the Middle East, were translated into Latin in the 600s. So the influence is going into Europe, not out of Europe, even though most of us associate paintings of the Virgin Mary with Europe. So the stories that come out of Africa are not talked about so much, even though these are really vital compositions, and you might even say the most vibrant tradition of stories about her, and these called Marian folk stories, Marian being the adjective for Mary. We have in Egypt paintings and stories that go back, 1,500 years, 1,700 years. Here's a little bit of a depiction of depiction of the Virgin Mary. You can see in the top left here is something from Egypt in the 600s. You can see on the right is another one. Sorry for the kind of Nubia in the 1000s. So on the left in this Nubian one is the Queen, on the right is the Virgin Mary. Interesting to think about race in this context. And then again on the bottom is another one from Egypt. So these are a big tradition in Africa. There are lots of paintings and murals and icons and books. So part of what we are doing today and tomorrow and over this workshop, we're talking about Ethiopia, we're talking about Ethiopian manuscripts, we're talking about Ge'ez manuscripts, but we're also talking about the Virgin Mary because of the focus of our particular project, about which we're going to say more. But we're trying to explore this richness in all the ways in which the Virgin Mary is centered and special and preeminent in African art. So this is kind of a good time here near the beginning of the workshop to kind of talk about some of the premises or the assumptions of what we're kind of talking about today. The first thing to say, as I've kind of emphasized already, is that we are talking about how the Virgin Mary is depicted in literature and art. That is our job. I'm an expert in literature, not religion. So in this sense, this is not a theology workshop. It is not an exploration of who Mary might have really been. It's a literature presentation. It's a literature discussion. I assume that it is impossible for us to know the original human being. All that we can know is how human beings have represented her. So this is all about how she was represented. I know that there's some terms that may be unfamiliar in any of these presentations. We often are kind of whipping along. If you hear something you don't understand, please write it down and ask us in the Q&A. Of course, you have a question, other people are going to have the same, similar kinds of questions. I teach a course using the website. It's called Healing and Justice, the Virgin Mary in African Literature and Art. And one of the things that I have to bring up in the class is that there may be people there who are people of faith, people who are Catholics, people from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and so on. And that if you come to this workshop, or the course as it was in that case, with a kind of personal devotion to the Virgin Mary, I'm like, that's fantastic. That's so great that you're here. You are bringing a lot of knowledge, and I really appreciate that. And I always tell my students that your contributions are going to be really important because you actually know something about this from your own personal experience or stories that your parents told you, and so on. I also warn them that the way that the Virgin Mary is depicted sometimes in this literature may seem strange to them or even sacrilegious, especially to someone raised in the United States, in the Protestant world or the Catholic world. You're going to be like, what is happening here? So, but for me, this is part of the reason that we study it, to open our eyes, to see things differently, and to have a better understanding of how other people think about things that we feel like we know. I also tell my students that if they are a believer, even if they are encountering these strange texts and so on, that I believe that they, as people of faith, have a strong faith, and that nothing I can do can shake that. I believe in you. I believe in your ability to analyze. I believe in you to maintain your faith, and so on. So I don't feel that anything we're doing here is going to shake it. I just feel that it's going to expand your understanding, and that you are going to be able to choose how you incorporate this into your faith. So I'm very aware that people here are often teaching in public schools, that this material may seem very religious to people and so on. I would love to hear more from you all about how you might handle that. But one of the things I do is to say, she's a literary character. We're looking at how people represent her, and we're trying to understand very different ways of looking at things. I wanted to say a little bit about myself, just that I was born actually in Philadelphia, but my father's a physician and my mother was a person who was very eager to do service in the world. And I went when I was 4 years old to Ethiopia to live in Gondar, where my father was teaching at the public health college. So my first memories are of living near a castle. In Gondar, there are castles that were built in the 1600s, right? You would drive along the road and you would see oxen threshing grain the way that they did in the Bible. In those days, it was, I'm old enough, there was a descendant of King David on the throne of Ethiopia at that time. So this is an incredible place to grow up as a child, right? To see this. And every Ethiopian has this privilege, but not many white Americans have this privilege. And one of my earliest memories is hiking up to the Queen Mentwab's palace, where there was a monastery, and seeing the monks writing manuscripts. And this had a profound impact on me. We then went to Ghana after that, and then I came back to the United States when I was 14. And we came back to Seattle, which in those days was extremely provincial. And people would ask me, oh, did you live in a tree? You know, did you have lions as pets? Many of you are very familiar with these kinds of comments and so on, right? And that's basically when I began my kind of project of saying, Africa is not what you think. Like beginning at 14 years old, trying to tell people, no, Africa is a place of incredible intellectual effervescence. And one of my friends once said, Wendy, all of your books, all of your publications have the same argument, which is give the people of Africa some credit. And I think that's a good summary of what I do. So just to tell you a little bit about myself. I became very interested in the stories, the Ethiopian stories about the Virgin Mary, and I'm going to tell you some of these stories a little bit later. But when I wanted to make a presentation back in 2013 about these stories, I found that when I went and looked at the research, I could not say even basic things about them. I couldn't say when a particular story dated to, or where it came from, or if it was actually European or not, all those kinds of things. So I wanted to set up something that would begin to answer these questions. And this is how this project PEMM, that is the source for this workshop, the Princeton Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Egyptian Miracles of Mary project. That's how it began, is to be able to try and establish answers to these kind of basic questions, which people had not done enough research on. And we have definitely been able to do those kinds of things. This is a kind of a last comment, is that the project really is about Egyptian as well as Highland Ethiopian stories. We, the people here, do not necessarily do a good job of representing Egypt because we're Ethiopianists, but it is absolutely there. There are lots of stories here. We're going to read one later today that's from Egypt. So just to kind of say we're a little bit biased or oriented in a direction, and you should definitely assume that the Egyptian tradition is really important, even if we're not always talking about that. Dawit talked about some of these things, but I just kind of want to give a tiny bit of kind of regional and cultural and religious context. And it used to be that I used to do presentations without giving this. And then I found in the Q&A, of course, none of you would ask any of these kinds of questions, but I would get questions where I was like, oh my God. So I just like to start, and this is something where if you're teaching, I also highly recommend that you do something like this. So here's what I do. First of all, a map. This is the region. As you can see here, oxen, which Dawit talked about a little bit, and it's spread and so on. So this is the region that we're talking about. Stories in Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, or Highland Ethiopia and Eritrea. The next thing to say, which was one of the questions that came up in the Q&A there, is that Egyptians were among the first Christians, and they were among the first people to actually depict the Virgin Mary. So people often kind of, they talk about Christianity as a kind of a white thing or European thing, but Africans were among the first Christians, and many Africans were Christians long before most Europeans had even heard of Christianity. So in terms of its roots, Christianity is more African than European. And this to me is a really important part of what I'm trying to present and talk about. And one of the things that you can use to talk about this is that the iconography for the Virgin Mary is heavily influenced by the depictions in Egypt of the ancient goddess Isis. She has often a crown. There's no reason why Mary should have a crown. She was not the queen of anything, but all of the queenly depictions of the Virgin Mary come from Isis. The fact that she's holding a son on her lap, often nursing that son, is also part of what has shaped the iconography for the Virgin Mary. So again, you could again say the depiction of the Virgin Mary is from the beginning more African than European. All of that is much later. It's also the case that a lot of the earliest books about the Virgin Mary were written in Egypt in this very early period. If you are Catholic, you might have heard some of these stories. If you're Protestant, you have never, ever heard any of these stories. But in the early centuries, people were very curious about Jesus's mother, and they wrote lots of books about her, where she was born, how she grew up, how she raised Jesus. There's a lot of stories here, and they've been really influential in Catholicism, even if people don't quite know it. And it's very important in the African tradition. And in these books, often Mary is the central character, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So the next thing that I always emphasize to my students is that Ethiopian Christianity is very ancient. The official conversion of the state or the empire was in the early 300s, and more Ethiopians became Christians over the centuries that followed. And to this day, Orthodox Christianity is still the predominant religion in Highland Ethiopia. So when we're talking about the Ethiopian church, no missionaries, no European missionaries. None of these people are Christians because of European missionaries. This is the thing I get. Which European missionaries went there to convert them? I'm like, no, before Europeans. As Dawit has explained so well, there's this scholarly language of CfAS, which dates very early, and the writing is very early. One of the things I learned recently is that CfAS was written before Arabic was written down. So an interesting little kind of fact there. The stories that we're reading in these classes have been translated into English, but they were all from CfAS. They've all been preserved in CfAS. And here you can see an Ethiopian scribe who is writing in this language down as it was a long time ago. The next thing that I always make sure, okay, the Christianity is really old, is that making books is also really old. All over Africa, but in Ethiopia in particular, they began creating these bound books in the 600s. And we just don't have records before this. So saying that they began writing original compositions in the 1300s is, I'm sure, not correct. But in terms of what's preserved, this is the period where we begin to see manuscripts, and we have actual manuscripts dating from the 1300s. For me, a lot of times when I'm talking with people, if I say I work on medieval African literature, people immediately say, oh, you work on oral literature. I'm like, no, I work on written medieval African literature. And people are like, well, you mean from Egypt? I'm like, no, it's all over sub-Saharan Africa. And also, by the way, we talk about Ethiopia, but there's been writing all over Africa. It's not exceptional. There are other places. What might be exceptional about Ethiopia is that it had monasteries with libraries that were dedicated to preserving manuscripts. That was maybe a little more unusual in the rest of Africa, but my premise is always that all African languages have always been written. It's just that we don't have them, these material things today. But all right, so there's a lot of things that are being created in this early period. As I just mentioned, there's lots of monasteries all over Ethiopia. They are preserving manuscripts, and this is a really important part of the Ethiopian tradition that is why we have so many manuscripts today. Of course, Ethiopians are the primary ones doing research on this amazing tradition. Here's a group of scholars that I know who came to Princeton to look at manuscripts, and you can see in front of them some of these manuscripts. So in terms of when you're talking to students, and if there's anything I can leave you with today is to remember 2 points. Christianity was African before it was European. The Christianity we discuss has nothing to do with European missionaries. Again, a really important point, otherwise you're going to get questions later. The paintings have nothing to do with European missionaries, and these Ethiopians have this 8 centuries of original written texts written by Africans for Africans in an African language. This is something that's really hard for people to incorporate, and that's why I have this super emphatic part of the presentation, because otherwise people just cannot compute that you're talking about medieval written African literature. They all think, if they know anything, that Africa only had written literature starting with Chenua Achebe's Things Fall Apart in 1958. And everything before that was Blank Darkness, as the title of the book goes. All right. So those are the things I really wanted to take away. Okay. So now we get to our main topic. So the primary focus of what we're doing in this workshop is a book called the Tamata Maria. Dawit, can you read the title of the book for me? And so the shorthand, Tamata Maria, how do you say it properly? Say it one more time. Tamata Maria. Yeah. So because I mispronounce it, I often refer to it as TM, which, you know, you can do if you want to. So this book, which Dawit referred to before, is really more properly thought of as a library. The Tamatamadim is not like the Bible that begins with Genesis always and ends with Revelations always. The Tamatamadim, a book, if you have a manuscript in front of you, it might have 3 stories about the Virgin Mary, or it might have 400 stories about the Virgin Mary. Or you might have 2 manuscripts, both of which have 75 stories, and they're the same 75 stories, but they're in a slightly different order. Or it might be that you have 2 books that have 150 stories, and the first 30 stories in both are the same, and after that, totally different. Because the tradition has at least 1,000 stories about the Virgin Mary. No one manuscript can contain all of them. People have certain interests and so on. So this is better thought of as a library, and this is why the issue of identifying which stories were told in which regions and so on is so complicated, because every time you come across a manuscript, you really don't know what stories are in it. So Dawit and Jeremy Brown, who you're going to meet tomorrow, and Mahari Wurku, who will not be here unfortunately with us, are the catalogers for these stories. And they have to go in and identify which stories are in these manuscripts. And this, by the way, is an incredibly difficult task because they do not have titles. What they have is something called an incipit or incipit, and that is a unique first line of the story. So they start the story and they look and they see, oh, yes, I recognize this first line, and I know that this is story. We have different ID numbers, 341. And these 3 scholars have minds like computers, and they are often coming in and reading the first one and knowing instantly that story, that story, that story. But if the story is really rare, then it gets more complicated, right? You've only seen it maybe 2 other times in a manuscript. So just to say a little bit about these particular stories. Now, this is the website where we're going to do an introduction later today and talk about it, but just to give you kind of the heads up about it. One thing I keep on talking about is Europeans and so on. So something just to say here is that when I was starting off, people would say the Tamatamadim was only translations. And they would do it like this. Well, you know, it's just translations. It's just translations. And I'm like, is it just translations? There's actually many scholars who say they're just translations from French, from France, right? They're in Latin, but they're from France, right? So our work here in reading all of these things is that we can tell you, in fact, out of 1,000 stories, 64 of them come to us from Europe. So it's definitely part of it, right? There's a famous story about the pregnant abbess and so on. They're definitely important stories, but they're a tiny part of the tradition. And they're really the seed of the tradition, right? Ethiopians read these stories and wanted to tell about the miracles that Mary had performed for them in Ethiopia. So they're there, but they're very small. So if somebody ever says to you, oh, well, you know, they're just translations, no, few of them are, but the vast majority of them are original compositions made in Ethiopia. And for me, the reason why I study these folk stories is that they are wild and amazing. This is not the Virgin Mary you might have met in your, you know, Protestant Sunday school or even your Catholic Sunday school. They're short, meaningful narratives about healing, often about reparative justice, and about personal ethics in a violent world. And they're quite extraordinary. So we have this project to collect this information, as you know. And as I mentioned, these stories are really dramatic. They show Mary saving people who are on their way to hell, even wicked people like cannibals. They show her saving people from storms, as you can see here, and dragons. Mary is giving water to a thirsty dog in one story. She's helping the sick. She's finding what's been lost. She's protecting the weak from the dastardly. She's aiding kings in battle. And these stories, some of which are read aloud in church, aid the faithful in remembering that no sin is too great for her power and no plea too late for her mediation. But mostly these are really great stories. They're full of slippery characters up to no good. And wide-eyed innocents ensnared in these ne'er-do-wells shenanigans. And they all stumble through these startling plot turns to arrive in the arms of the all-forgiving mother. So around 100 of these stories have paintings. And again, you're going to be hearing about that tomorrow. In terms of the idea about earlier paintings depicting people in different ways, you can see here on the top right that there is some of that happening here. So what I wanted to do in the few minutes I have left, when am I supposed to be? It's over? 12:15. So I'm a little bit early. I'd like to tell you one of these stories. So one of these stories begins, there was a nobleman from the town of Kemmer who was Christian in name. He did not eat bread. He did not eat beef. He ate only human flesh. He ate all of his servants who did not flee, and all of his friends. And then he sat down and he ate his wife and his children too. Then this madman was all alone. This is the opening of this story, right? So this man, the nobleman, takes up a gourd of water and a bow and arrow, and he leaves town. Nothing is ever explained in these stories. This is why they make such great teaching, because you have to unpack everything. You have to figure everything out, right? Why is he leaving, right? Like maybe there's no one left to eat. I don't know. So he goes on the road with his gourd and his bow and arrow, and he comes across a farmer. And he studies the farmer, and he's like, he's too strong. I can't get him. But for whatever reason, he goes up to him and he says, sell me your ox, because the farmer is plowing the fields with his ox. And I will give you my bow. And the farmer's like, no, I need the ox to plow. If I don't plow, I don't have wheat. If I don't have wheat, I don't have bread. I need the ox to live, right? And the cannibal's like, how about if I give you the bow and the arrows? The guy's like, no, I'm not having it, right? So then the cannibal says, well, okay, can you show me to a cave where I can spend the night? And the farmer's like, but why? There's a town here. You can just stay in the town. And the cannibal's like, no, I need to stay in a cave. And then the farmer, for whatever reason, is like, oh, I know who you are. I've heard about you. You are a really, truly wicked man. And the cannibal says, who, me? So that's really like, what are you talking about? So at any rate, the farmer points him to a cave. And the cannibal goes to the cave. And he says to himself, you know, I'd rather die than become a vegetarian. And he dies. So then the angels of light and the angels of darkness come. And the angels of darkness say, this man has to go straight to hell. And they're ready to take him away. But I forgot a really important part of the story. So let me back up for a second. Excuse me. After he talks to the farmer, backing up, he continues on the road with his gourd of water and his bow and arrow. And he comes across a beggar. And the beggar says to him, please give me a drop of water in the name of the martyrs. And the cannibal's really angry. No, absolutely not, right? Please give me a drop of water in the name of, it's not Jesus Christ, but it's another, really important kind of figure. The cannibal's like, no. And then he says, please give me a drop of water in the name of Mary. The cannibal stops, thinks about it, and he says, I've heard the Virgin Mary helps people. Okay, I'm gonna do it, right? So he lifts the gourd and he starts to pour the water into the beggar's throat. But in this kind of paradox, the beggar's throat is so desiccated that the water burns him, and he shoves the guy away and he says, stop trying to kill me. So, okay, then the cannibal leaves, he goes to the cave, he says, I'd rather die, he dies, and the angels of darkness come, and they're getting ready to take him to hell, but Mary shows up. And she says, you can't take him to hell. This man did something in my name. And Christ promised me, this is a really important part of the tradition, that if somebody did something for me, that they would be protected. And the angels of darkness are like, what? No. And she's like, look, we have to take him to Christ to adjudicate this case. So they go to heaven, and the angels of darkness say, Jesus, this man is the worst sinner who ever lived. And Jesus says, I agree. I think he has to go straight to hell. And Mary's like, no, look, he did something in my name, so we have to protect him. And Jesus is like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put the sins, he ate 78 people, in the balance, right? The weighing balance on one side, and we're going to put the drop of water on the other side. And we're going to see which one is weightier. And in fact, this single act of partial, even cynical, you might say, kindness outweighed these sins, and the cannibal indeed goes to heaven. So this is a great story to teach with because it's a kind of koan, right? In the tradition, the koan is something where classic koan is, what do you do if you meet the Buddha? And the answer is you slap him, right? It's something like, what? What are you talking about? This story to me is a koan where you have to really think about what is happening here. Is this right? Is this justice? And so on. And it makes for great, great discussion. So having given you this story, I'm going to say I am now at my 12:15, and Dawit is going to come and lead the Q&A, and we're going to, people who are online are welcome to ask questions as well.
All right. In the oral version of the story, by the way, when the scales are being weighted between the soul and the water, the soul is heavier. And then Mary comes and puts her kind of like back towards it, and then the water is heavier because of
It's a little finger on the scale.
Right. It's her shadow, it says.
She tipped the scale.
Does she live it spiritually, or does she
Yeah,
actually?
what are you saying?
Well, that's how the story goes, is interpretation. Yes.
The classic koan, how do you spell the word koan?
K-O-A-N.
K-A-O-N.
K-O-A-N. Yes.
K-O-A-N.
And I have to tell you, I really don't know that much about it, but to me, I just have to use this word when I'm talking about this story because people are so shocked and perplexed. And I'm like, no, but this is a really useful place to be. It's like,
Questions?
if the story is still percolating through your mind,
Yeah.
right? You're like, what?
That part that just said, I'd rather die than be a vegetarian, but I heard it in a, I know it's funny, but I heard it in a. No. It's a comic book that is, it's an Ethiopian comic book, but it's written in, I feel like he said it, but it's,
Balaisab.
Balaisab?
Yes, yes, that's the cannibal story, man eater. I'm using actually kind of problematic term, cannibal, but the actual word that's used in Ge'ez is man eater,
Balaisab, yeah.
which is, so you've heard of him.
Well, I don't know if I heard it, well, I heard it in English, but your exact quote, but it was Eton comic, Ethiopian comic book, which is so great for young learners.
Oh,
On IG, it's ETAN comics, Eton comics, and it's, for the age group that we're talking about. And there are comic books, Ethiopian Eritrean comic books, they're still kind of in the new, or, you know, they're new, but their authors and writers are, for me, who grew up in America, I feel like I'm very American, so I have to kind of go back to these type of literature, comic books to connect my own, to connect with my own heritage.
Absolutely,
Thank you.
absolutely.
It was a great story.
Yeah. And that's the PEMM website too, right? We were talking earlier about, well, if you don't read Ge'ez or you don't read Amharic, you can go and read these stories in English. And we have, you know, over 600 of these 1,000 stories we have there in translation.
other questions? Yes.
I'm just curious about, I'm a child in your class. Mary's a virgin? Think you're gonna ask? So I hope you reconcile that, but you just tell them next class, I'll do it.
In Ethiopia, she's a double virgin.
Oh, Lord.
Twofold virgin. She is pure in body and pure in mind. She never even thought about sexual
I don't think they're gonna take that,
things.
but I'll take it.
It's just part of the tradition and about how special she is, right? And this kind of really interesting liminal space in which Mary lives, where she's a human being, but she's kind of divine.
You had mentioned that often some of the like stories or some of the manuscripts tell the same story again and again. Or
No.
slight variation. I just wanted to.
Yeah, so there are a few stories that have two versions, and you will sometimes get that. But no, it's just that if you, to try and emphasize the idea of the library, that if you can have two manuscripts that have 75 stories, one might have, in terms of ID numbers, it might have 1 through 75, and one might have 1 through 33, and then 400 through 450, right? A totally different body of stories. Dawit, I don't know if you want to say anything since.
Yeah, so some stories are popular, some are less popular. Oh, sorry. Yes. And one thing that I always think about as coming, thinking from the American perspective is when we're representing the genre of the miracles of Mary, we should kind of represent the as much as we can, the whole kind of body of literature. So for example, Balai Sab is extremely popular. It's I think the most popular story in the miracles of Mary. They just, people love the story, right? But there are also other stories out there. And sometimes too, I think the Westerner, if you talk about Balai Sab and there's this perception, that's what the miracles of Mary is about. But there's a story I always talk about is it's a miracle of a deacon doing liturgy in church. He's holding a candle, he gets tired, falls asleep, the church is burning down, and all of a sudden Mary comes, and through her grace, the church is saved from being burned down. I've seen that happen, you know what I mean? Like, this is real things that happen on the ground, right? So you have like a mixture, and there are other stories where the priest is trying to get into the church, it's locked, he prays, the church is open. So there are like different versions of the story. And sometimes we have to think about how we want to represent the stories as well. The Balai Sab is a very important story, very present, right? And you find that in multiple manuscripts. And then you also find these other stories as well. So this is kind of like making sure that we get like a full picture of the story. It's almost like if I wanted to do research on American culture and I meet Bill Gates and I hang around with him all day. And I'm like, this is what America is about. You know what I mean? It's like, that's one part of it. It definitely exists, luxury and all this stuff. But there's also these other stories that are less common. So Balai Sab is one of the most common stories. Sometimes you might find it in, several of the manuscripts and other times. Yeah.
I think it's a really helpful thing to say is that it's also controversial, right? Like, people love it. Somebody once told me that his mother never prayed to Our Lady Mary. She always prayed to Our Lady of the Man-Eater, Our Lady of the Cannibal, right? But for her, I mean, a lot of people are really worried about their sins, right? And if you think about this story, you're like, I think I'm gonna be okay. Like, this guy, Mary took care of this guy, right? And we feel so burdened by little things that we did, right? So it's a great comfort. But I also talked to a priest who said that in the Ethiopian Orthodox Seminary, that his teacher was like, if I could make this story disappear, I would do it. It's so theologically problematic, right? And I'm like, what theologians think and what human beings or people are popular, the public thinks are often quite different And for whatever reason, this story is hugely popular and a tremendous comfort to people.
One last question.
Yes.
For teachers who would like to use this in their classroom, always looking for a moral to the story to wrap up, what would that be? Scales of justice, an ounce of good outweighs a pound of evil. What might be or is that open to interpretation?
I mean, I think you don't have to teach with this story. And there would be lots of, there are lots of Ethiopians who would say, no, that's super problematic. You're reinforcing the idea that Africans are cannibals, blah, 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 right? But one of the things I think about it is that I'm just going to think about a particular political figure. I'm not going to give any names.
You can't guess, don't worry.
And I'm like, would this man do even a single act of kindness? Would he? Would he?
Would he?
I think maybe not. I think maybe it's saying that actually a human being who can do even a single act of kindness is actually a different kind of person than this person I'm thinking about. Now, that's probably not true. That person probably has done something. But it's also that in the moment he said, I've heard about Mary and I've heard she can help people. So he's in the posture of saying, I have a problem. I need help, right? So I don't know. I find the story very moving. I don't necessarily think about, I mean, obviously he's a monster, right? But that even for a monster, there can be a moment of, I think I need help.
Moment of humanity.
Yeah.
So there's a theological perspective that I think someone offered this explanation that I thought was interesting is, so she's a refuge. I think in the Bible, I believe Leviticus it talks about this city that you could run into for refuge, and once you're there, you've committed some crime, you're safe, right? Then nobody can touch you. And Mary's acting like that city of a refuge where she, once you invoke her name, you have protection. So if we could think of it like this, there's some, relationship with other cultures and things like that. And it makes sense. Now for a classroom, maybe in a theology setting, it works. I'm not sure in middle school, high school, how we would be able to have these conversations. Yes.
Okay, so I teach in School of Allied Nursing and Allied Health and Occupational Therapy. So I was kind of thinking, how do I apply this? So we have different tenets of codes of ethics, and I could kind of see how we could pull in some pieces as far as ethical pieces, occupational justice, things of that nature. Let's try to relate on how I can incorporate some of these things in classroom, like discussions, case studies, things of that nature.
Yeah, so I'm doing using the miracles of Mary for my dissertation, and one way that I approach the text is I shift the focus from Mary to the characters. And by talking about the characters, number one, you mentioned this earlier, whenever you mention religion, people get real tense.
Yeah.
Right. So by shifting the conversation from Mary to the people, and Mary has the supporting role, then you could focus on, okay, what were the characters like? And I think we're going to do the close reading later on.
Yeah.
And we'll really see what you can learn about the society, the people, and all this stuff. So I think that's one way.
Yeah. There's also to me something about the fact that it's a nobleman, right? Like the elites, the wealthy eating people, the consuming people. Yeah.
What I was gonna say is actually very close to what Dawit said, is that from a social studies perspective, and in a classroom where we're talking about maybe world history or different cultures around the world, you look at that story and you can bring up questions to your class in terms of what does atonement mean? What does redemption mean? What does it mean to you personally and in your family or in your community? What is the worst thing a person can do? And what does it take to be redeemed from that? Right? And what does that say to the culture of the people who wrote this particular story in terms of their values and their worldview? And how does that reflect back to you personally? Or how does that compare to maybe other civilizations that you've studied in the course or in the class? So there's ways that this can be applied in terms of, like you were saying, the characters themselves. What does it say from a social studies perspective? What does it say from a human perspective? And how can we apply what we know of ourselves and our own families, our own environment, to what we are learning about people from these other places and other parts of the world and their cultures?
There's actually a really interesting scholar who said that African stories in general do not have morals. They are intended as puzzles. They're intended to spark conversation, right? It's supposed to not end it, but to open it up and like, is it okay? Do you agree with this? And so on. So if you think about this, where it's meant to challenge you, it's meant to make you say, I don't know, is that right or not? And that it's useful to think about them in that way too.
Yeah, so I'm Polish, so I'm different always. In my perspective, we don't ask for help, but we try to channel the energies that we can help ourselves. And I find a great connection with what I witnessed. I'm like, I travel the world. I've just completed 101 countries and I do a lot of solo travel. 106, whatever. But when I was in Iztapalapa, in Mexico, they have the same situation, but differently handled, where you wear a cross on your back, and it's serious cross. You know, it could be a piece of wood this big, and by that, and a little child could have that on the back, depending. I mean, that's exaggeration. By the end of the week, you know, hyperbole is one of my main characteristics. But it might be smaller, but imagine a 9-year-old that would have crossed this big by this. So the child starts carrying it up this hill. I forgot the name of the hill, but if the child is falling, she can help me. I can lean on her. But the way I atone for my sin, I have to reach like that TV. And the weight of the cross is not depending on the age of the child, the size, but what some god or goddess, I mean, you know what I mean, like the governor or what, but somebody, maybe a politician, they have a way of doing it, deems the severity of the sin. So she can have a cross this life, and a 6-year-old could have a cross as heavy as the table. And they actually fall on the ground and bleed. I mean, because they have to try to get up and they get bruised. And I was just so, in the end, of course, I talked my way into getting on the roof of the person's house. And I could see the whole view, and I was invited to dinner.
I think you have to think like, he didn't express remorse, but he was trying to buy the cow, the ox, right? Like, is he trying to switch? Is that a kind of action-based repentance or something? Yeah. I think we do have some questions here, but we're supposed to end now. We have one more minute. Or
One question. Then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see them.
Is there any work being done on the tweed collection here at Howard?
Maybe we'll defer on that question. The veneration of Mary in Islam. Yeah.
Veneration of Mary in Islam. Ooh.
That this story actually has a relationship to an Islamic hadith from the 800s. We don't have time to go into that, but just to say, yes, there is a connection. There's something about elephants here, already Christianized before. So Ethiopia and Armenia are considered the first 2 Christian nations in the world. Version PowerPoint, yeah. So I'd love to talk with you guys too about what would be helpful in terms of having a PowerPoint presentation on any of this. Yep. Yeah. Well, yes, just to say that somebody once said to me, Christianity is a religion where they worship an instrument of torture with an act of cannibalism. So cannibalism obviously is an ongoing theme for Christianity.
However, you mentioned Armenian. when I look at the Armenian manuscript, it looks like this, but upside down. It's very similar. And why is that? Is there a connection? Is there history attached to it?
I mean, all scripts basically are from other scripts, right? So there'll be like the T, right? You see the T's in Greek, the T's in Coptic, the T's in Ge'ez.
But it looks, I mean, it looks, if you put it side by side, it just looks like it's upside down. So, I don't know, maybe, I don't know if you've ever thought that, but. it's
I
very
don't
similar.
know enough about it, but maybe you can do a little research and come back and tell us. Ge'ez is so early, right? The language is at least 800 BCE. The writing is, early, 200s and stuff. So in general, probably Armenian would be derivative, and that would make sense because they are the same type of Christianity, which is this so-called Oriental Orthodox, sometimes they call it, or Neophysite, sometimes it's one. So thank you so much for listening, and now we go back to Brenda.
Thank you.
And we'll talk about another story or something.
Just very quickly, we're going to break for lunch from now until 1:15. We have a display over there of materials from our library, some books, and then some of the activities that we've done on Ethiopia over the years. And I wanted to remind people, come on Friday, because this is when you get your gift book, Ethiopia at the Crossroads, which is the exhibit that was at the Walters Museum in Baltimore. So see you at 1:15.